And she got royalty checks, small ones, $150 a year for a few years. And it's still available, but you got to order it specifically. And but after reading that, I felt guilty because I told Greg this already. My mother was a pretty cultured, educated, music, arts, all that stuff. She was in the Cleveland Symphony Youth as the lead harpist. Then she made appearances in the Cleveland Symphony when they needed extra harps. Then the Depression, and my grandfather, who was a fairly prominent businessman in Akron, Ohio, shipped his family, including my mother, up to a farm he had just got for nothing over near Lottsville. And there she later met my father, who was the original Archie Bunker, except he was natively smarter than Archie. But as far as dealing with women and people, he was Archie. And in the kitchen, bacon and eggs, and that's your job. And if you remember the Archie Bunker, it was like Archie always stifled. His word was stifled. Ethel. Well, that's the way my mother was. When my father died, and she still had a little life left, God, she went to, I used to have it hanging on that wall when she was alive, with arrows to all the places she'd been, Alaska, Germany, 3 times, England, all over. She toured, and she wrote a journal similar to that book for every one of them. And I realized then what a smart and intellectually curious woman she really was. And all of my life, I sort of sided with my father on everything and just took her for granted. And that actual book, I don't know if you guys want me to get this personal, but that book itself is a story. I had told her when I won my first jury verdict, Mom, I have a skill here, and one of these days I'm going to buy you a beautiful house. And years passed by, and finally the house I bought her is the one at 3 Webster in Lakewood, which is on the corner of Webster and Terrace, right straight across the driveway from John Anderson's driveway. It's the biggest lot in square foot in all of Lakewood, and it was a magnificent place. And when she got old and crippled, arthritic buckled her fingers, and she couldn't get around, and we all knew she had to go somewhere else, a nursing home. And we set up a dinner at her house, and 39 adults were all seated in a chair with a plate or a little card table or something in the living room when we were going to announce that she had to go away to a nursing home. I was the spokesman and tapped the spoon on the glass. Like to have everybody's attention for a minute. I had my speech all ready, and she pipes up right then and says, Arthur, do you mind if I speak for a few minutes before you? And it'll only take a few minutes. I said, no, go ahead. And she said, look, nobody has told me why we're having this big gathering, and there's no Thanksgiving, there's no Christmas, there's no other reason. I know the reason. I know the reason better than any of you. I'm not afraid. I know I've got to go to a nursing home, and I am going to go to a nursing home so that I'm neither a burden on anybody's family, and because modern nursing homes are really a place of nourishment for the brain if you treat it that way, instead of a place to vegetate. And that's what I'm going to do. I want everybody to know that I finished a course in Chautauqua this summer on writing and writing skills and publication of what you write. And when I go to the nursing home, I'm telling you all now that I'm going to write a book. I'm going to get it published. And I am not going to vegetate. Anybody can come and go as they wish to visit me, but you'll see me doing. She did it in longhand. And the only connection I had with it was I then had a secretary who knew her and liked her, and she had for years, when she wanted to write something special, she would have Julie do it. She set up her deal with Julie so she would come down every evening and get the pages that my mother had written. And I really got so that I thought, wait, Julie, don't go overboard. You're doing more for her than you are for me, because Greg will tell you, some days you dictate a lot. Some days you don't do any. And in this day and age, half of your time is spent talking to 20, 30 lawyers and judges around the country on that speakerphone, which is disconnected. Long story short, that was the outcome. And it put a friggin' lump in my throat. I forgot half of it, you know. Does it say anything in there about the name of the band that I formed in Salamanca? The Sax Maniacs.
Sax Maniacs.
Yeah, listen, you're not going to believe this one. I don't think she put it in, but the truth is, my father, who had rolled over a car coming back from Salamanca, walked into the house one day and said, look, say goodbye to your friends. We're leaving. Just before my senior year in high school, I had everything in front of me. I was the president-elect of the student council and class and everything, and none of us wanted to go. You know, kids never do. Wherever they are, they like. Anyway, Archie Bunker said, hey, bullshit. I've had 3 accidents now. Every one of them were my fault. I fell asleep because he'd work all night long and start driving back at 7 in the morning. And he said, I haven't hurt anybody else. I haven't hurt myself, but I got the message. We're going. And long story short, he got a house in amazing, of course, getting a house in Salamanca with all of their problems was no big deal, but he got it quick. And we moved quick. And I moved into Salamanca on September 1st of 52. And it was my senior year. And, oh, you've read the book. Okay. On September 23rd, I got elected again. And there are more goddamn students. That seemed like biggest place in the world to me. Panama had 32 in my class. And about that number for the next 4 grades. Salamanca had close to 300. It was bigger than the whole Panama school. And anyway, end of story. But because, the whole punchline was, what's this got to do with the dance band? I was just to the age where I was kind of popular kid, but girls would ask me to dance. I couldn't fucking dance 1 inch, okay? Because I still had that leg brace and polio. So I thought, how in the hell am I going to get out of this without embarrassment dripping out of my armpits? And I hit on it. I'm going to organize a band. And I'd been in all the bands in Panama and so on. And I played tenor sax. There was an excellent sax player that played alto, and a woman that played a soprano sax, which is a very unusual instrument. But it was a great theme. And the tenor sax is the one that always has the melody. Everybody else is a harmony supporter. That's why I played the tenor sax, because that was easier. But I got pretty good. This was a Panama. Evelyn Button was my teacher. And I was better than average when I went to Salamanca. Put this band together, and the best musician in the band was the drummer. He wrote all the music. He arranged it. I couldn't make a down payment on that part of it. But you will know him personally, Randy. His name was Darrell Jones. His father was the CEO of Market Basket Restaurants, and you guys bought Market Basket, I think, eventually. Your first company. Anyway, and he was the thing, and we talked about, name it. We had 3 saxophones, piano and drums, and 1 trumpet, which was a background piece. And I thought, God, let's call it the Sax Maniacs. All right? Now, when you see every other word on TV today, women say it, just language is horrible. But within my lifetime, which is now a long time ago, but I got called into the goddamn principal's office. The PTA had put up a little petition. What is this terrible thing, the Sax Maniacs? It really means sex maniacs, and so on. And I was in front of the principal. His name is William Valent, and trying to say, there's no connection. That isn't what it means. There's 3 saxophones. what would you call it? A trombonist band? And he said, hey, Arthur, you came in here for the purpose of listening to me. Your purpose in coming in here was not to convince me of something. You're going the wrong way on a one-way street. You change that name or you're in for trouble. And I didn't want to do it, and I didn't do it. But we did take down the signs. But on a microphone, we played for every dance. Now, here I am, head of the goddamn group, but I'm not dancing. And nobody would expect the band guy to be dancing. So that's the whole background on that. I tried to do it again in college, but the band was better. But all people gave a shit about was drinking beer and having fun and doing whatever they had to do to get by. And so here endeth the career of me in music. But
how did your dad end up in Lottsville area? What's your dad's?
Because he was born. That's my great Jackson connection. Out of Lottsville, when you go towards Columbus, you go across a little bridge and then go up and across some terrible railroad tracks. And just past the railroad tracks, up this frigging mountain, is a road. And up until 2 or 3 years ago, the name of that road was Bailey Hill. And the whole mountain was Bailey Hill. And my grandfather owned a huge farm up on the top, which has got nothing to do with anything. That's where my dad and technically it's where I was born. But I was only there for a few weeks when I was born. But the downslope, the other end of that humongous hill, goes into Spring Creek. Okay? Now, remember all the reading you've done about Jackson's farm cutting across? The lower end of it is Broken Straw. Okay. That man will tell you that the backside of my dad's farm out in Niobe, the Broken Straw runs through the back of it, goes under the bridge by the C&E tracks, which is about a 7-iron away from where he was born.
The camera, the he is Randy Sweeney.
Yeah, and it goes down to Lottsville, then curves around and eventually goes down near Spring Creek, and the Broken Straw then goes into the Allegheny, and you know.
At the Buckaloons.
Yeah.
I was there just the other day. I digress.
All right. Well, this whole thing is a digression. Okay.
We were talking about your dad, your grandfather. Kind of a little bit about him, your dad. I know we got that Archer Bunker story, but what was his background like?
He was born on a farm. He went to Lottsville High School. There were only 8 or 10 in his graduating class, one of whom was his best friend by the name of Raymond Lau, later quite famous in Warren as Dr. Raymond Lau, Lowe. He and my dad were, I would say, outstanding students by the judgment of that day. And believe it or not, one of their courses was writing, handwriting. You were scored on your exams in those days, partially on your handwriting. And today, we all know what happened to that. My father did not go to college, but he went to four-year college. He attended with my aunts at Jamestown Business College, which they all graduated from. And so did most of the other good students from that area. And in those days, Jamestown Business College was a very recognized place. I used to think, in fact, I got one story which you cannot get on the tape, but my father was always clever. He was a good speaker and a frequent speaker. And at the time when I was growing up and going to college, I felt quite superior to him and everybody else that didn't go to college. And I felt lucky that I could and did. And I'll never forget, when I got to University of Buffalo, one of my best friends, this is in law school, first year law school, one of my best friends in law school was a guy named Ron Tills, who later became a Supreme Court justice. And he was always talking to me about, God, I wish I lived down in Salamanca. You guys got deer all over. And he was a frustrated deer hunter. And I invited him home for a weekend and an extra day if we needed it because of deer hunting season. And it was in my, I can't remember which year, but when we got home, obviously the family sat around and had a whole bunch of tales and talk over dinners and otherwise. And Ron, this, by the way, it was not law school, it was college, UB. Ron and I had done well in economics. And we were all full of the fact that if you understood how the Federal Reserve works and the multiplier principle and the fallacy of thrift, the paradox of thrift, you could adjust the valves on any economy to make money more available, less available, keep the interest rates right, and inflation right, and so on. And late in our dinner, whole family around, Ron was pontificating about, Mr. Bailey, Art has told me about how terrible your Depression days were and everybody around you. And now that economics has been invented, just like we invented it then, if they had known then what we know now, that whole Depression was not necessary. Didn't have to go through that. Because if they had done this valve and this valve, they could have prevented the whole thing. And my dad listened, didn't argue with him. And finally he pipes up and says, Ron, you're down here to hunt deer this weekend, right? Yes. And he said, did you ever notice when you're trailing deer that their waste droppings are just little pellets? And even though they're a big animal. And yeah, no, I know. I know how to track deer, and I know that. And my father then said to him, well, did you ever notice when people keep horses, their waste is always in a ball, a horse ball. And then he mentioned a cow and carried that out. And he said, Ron, do you know why that is? No, I don't have any idea. And my father said, almost in a shout, that's just what I thought. Here, you don't know shit, and you're trying to teach me about economics. And Ron Tills remembered that until he died 2 years ago. And it was in front of my mother, who was red-faced, my brother, who went under the table. Dad's always saying stupid stuff, you know, but he was right on.
Dead on. We can all identify with that. And your mother, you mentioned a little bit about the book and her background. What's your background? Was she a Lottsville person also?
No. She was born in the Boulevard section of Akron, Ohio, in Firestone Park. And she went to Firestone Park High School, which in those days was like Williamsville or Eggertsville, upscale. Her father, my grandfather, had the good fortune of working for the Burke and Noble, N-O-B-I-L, family in Akron, Ohio, who owned WAKR and Akron Beacon Journal and another news store, huge store, of course, to a guy, 5, 6, 7 years old. Huge has got a different meaning. Called Sun Radio. And they were the first distributors of television in the late 40s in all of Ohio, because Burke and Noble had some influence. They made a pact with Philco, and because of that, the first TV that ever hit this part of Western New York was in our living room, then out in Niobe. And we used to, my brother and I would have to climb up on the roof and turn the antenna, if they wanted a different station, turn the antenna towards Erie or towards Buffalo, and the only way you could do it was with somebody down on the ground shouting a little more, that's too much, and believe it or not, but people used to come for miles around and watch the TV through the window. Now, when it was possible and we knew them, we'd have them come in, but not always, and especially if they sat in a car in front of the house looking in. But TV in those days was a miracle, even though it was a cross between snow and fading in and out black and Miltonboro, Texaco, and all those programs of the 50s. But the reason that my mother and her two brothers came up to Lottsville, as I told you, is because he lost his home on Firestone Park, which was the boulevard section of Firestone Park. Has got magnificent homes. It's like LeBrun Drive up in Buffalo. And he was cutting his losses, and he shipped his kids up to, and his wife, for a year before he came up. And then after the Depression, he went back down and started up the same thing. But that's how she came to Hicksville, and which was Lottsville. And I was born on that Bailey Hill farm, and if you look at topo maps, you can trace right down to Spring Creek and West Spring Creek, to where that was. And that enters into my first Jackson exposure. My high school teacher, and I think it's true, everybody has some teacher in their past who turned them from a know-nothing, do-nothing person into an intellectually curious person. And Jackson wrote all about his teachers that were that way. Mine was Helen Johnson, and she used to whisper all the time, "Artie, you're special. You got to do more. I don't care if you got a 98. You could have done better. I know you could." And she treated me that way every hour I was around her. But the one thing she said is, you should study about Robert H. Jackson. He was born on a farm just like you were, on the backside of our hill, because she treated it as her hill too. She lived right at the bottom of it, right by the railroad crossing. She used to sing his praises. Now keep in mind, in the 50s, when I was in high school, Jackson was on the Supreme Court. And she would pound that drum all the time. And then when I moved to Salamanca, I forgot about that. And the next time Jackson reappears is when I'm in law school. And the dean of our law school was Jacob D. Hyman, a former Harvard law professor, but during the war, he was the lawyer in charge of one of the letters, OPA, or one of Roosevelt's agencies, and he was the best fan of Jackson's ever. And he used to make me read to the class Jackson's dissent in Korematsu, and I would choke up. I'm 20 years old or whatever. I would choke up when I would read, he committed no wrong except to be born of a mother inside United States, and then on and on and on. And I used to think, in fact, all of the socially conscious law students used to think, I believe they all thought, that the rest of the Supreme Court judges were stupid because they could not accept that logic. Fast forward 59 years, and I think the other justices didn't necessarily agree or reject Jackson's philosophy, but they had a gun at their back because that was an army order, and they would be defying their own government if they went with Jackson. And the more I study, the more I'm convinced that that is correct. They really knew. In fact, this is a very bad comparison, but if you're old enough to remember Barry Goldwater, he used to say, in your heart, you know I'm right. And on the points, most of America thought, yeah, he really is right. But I don't want to make any modern day analogies to that, but in any event, I became a serious Jackson's, I don't want to say scholar, let me say fan, after studying his Supreme Court decisions. And now I do it every day, something every day. I just wrote a brief to the appellate division where I said, I believe every justice who, oh, by the way, I made a motion to re-argue pursuant to 221 CPLR. Mm-hmm. Most lawyers think that's something you can do in the Supreme Court only. Not so. You can do it in the appellate division too. And I quoted Jackson on this. Each one of you justices who previously voted on this question must feel the awesome circumstances that Justice Robert H. Jackson found himself in this case, and I got the right case, where he said, he said, simply because I was unconsciously wrong yesterday, I am not compelled to be consciously wrong today. And
it's beautiful.
You've read that, haven't you?
Oh,
yeah. Thank God for those kind of teachings. And they're not teachings anyway. They are statements which, when you think and you analyze yourself, they're right on. And that is the secret of all persuasion in sales, in ministry, in law, even in medicine, that you have to construct arguments in such a manner that the listener makes certain conclusions that they think are right. You can shout what you think all day long. Most people are impervious to that. But if you can hit them in the gut and make them, in their own mind, conclude this way and this way and this way, pow, then they make the right decision. And that's what Jackson did, I think.
So your mom and dad, they meet in Lottsville and then marry?
Yep.
And then move to Niles.
Yes. Simply because my father and my uncle were two of the highest positions in or on the Erie Railroad. Back in those days, Erie Railroad was phenomenal. All railroads were. But the Erie had a right-of-way track from New York, Jersey City shoreline, to Chicago, and 1,000 miles long in round numbers. And I remember my father saying, you know, the Erie Railroad has to pay $1,000 per mile for every mile that they own track. And meanwhile, we get 1.5 cents for every piece of first-class mail we deliver. Meanwhile, airlines get paid 7 cents, and later a lot more, per mile with no tax, no right-of-way, no facilities, just landing at an airport which, guess what, was built for them by governments of one form or another. And how fair is that? And I remember also he actually cried when the Erie Railroad went out of business and sold its right-of-way. He said, you, to me and my brother both, are probably going to live long enough to realize what a horrible mistake that was, because the future of railroads will come back and they will then have to repurchase the same right-of-way all over again. They are not smart enough to look at Europe, and he knew all the statistics about Europe and their railroads. All the trains ran on time. It was a classy way. He made us take a trip on the Orient Express just so that we could see what an opulent train ride was, and so on. He was right about a lot of things. But right today, railroads, in fact, Elon Musk's newest invention is the tunneling between highly populated areas, starting Los Angeles to San Francisco and back, underground. And you can do that in about 45 minutes because you're going hundreds of miles, several hundred miles an hour with no stops. Because you've got pushing with jet engines and pulling the air out from in front of the big cigar by vacuum. And when you get the vacuum sucking forward and the jet propulsion pushing behind, you wind up going faster than an airplane. No crossroads, no stoplights, nothing. It's point A to point B quickly. And now he's trying to do the same thing on a straight line. Most people don't realize there is a straight line between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. There are no left or right turns on that route. And that's where he's going to try the second one. But we didn't.
So Niobe, that's on the line. Is there a reason why he kind of dropped the family there at Niobe?
Yeah, because my uncle Melvin hired him from doing the work he was doing in Lottsville on his crew. And he was always a great fanatic about numbers, checkbook. He used to make sure that we could balance a checkbook before, like 8 or 9 years old. And he'd give us one to do. And if you did it wrong, that was a sad day. And you better feel lower than whale shit if you can't even balance a checkbook. And you got the next 100 people that walk by that front window, 70% of them can't balance a checkbook. And another thing he was a fanatic on, and I'm ashamed that I've lost it, but he was an excellent typist. So were all 3 of his sisters. And he was the youngest. And probably that's why he was a good typist, because back in those days, another reason he was hired is because he was one of the experts, Dit-Daw Morse code on the railroad. That's how they communicated for 1,000 miles in those days. And if you could not do the, my brother and I used to call it the Dit-Daw, fast enough to be speaking speed, you better go out and work on the tracks. And he told us, in fact, I'm the only student in my senior class at Panama that absolutely had to take typing, which every other girl took, but no boys took. But Arthur Bailey did. And I got 97 on the typing regents, and been ashamed of it ever since. But now, when I find lawyers making incredible amounts of money a year, being excellent high-credential lawyers, doing their own emails all over the country. My son's firm in Chicago, they don't have what we call secretaries. Even briefs that are written by them. And I don't know how they can possibly do it. And I'm too old to try. But I'm still, my brain talks to my mouth. My mouth talks to a machine. And I do dictate basically error-free, not over 1 in 10 letters or documents that I dictate do I ever have to make corrections in, because I think and talk slowly, and if the transcriber can't get that, then you got the wrong transcriber. But that's the way it's always been. And when I first came to town, the only electronic dictation equipment was wire. And you'd dictate in those days from 10:30 at night till 4:30 in the morning, and almost ready to put the cherry on top of a brief, and the friggin' wire would break. Now, that's all wasted. And there used to be one guy in town that could splice it, but he used up, seemed like hundreds of feet in the splicing, so that your conclusion was always cut off. And now, by the way, do you use Dragon, naturally speaking, Greg, in your firm? There is now the leading products. I understand there's some later models that are even better, which is Dragon, naturally speaking. And what it does is translate the voice to the keyboard, and out it comes typed. No human being sees it. Now, in the early versions, you had to be a perfect dictator in order to achieve a high percentage. But believe it or not, the computer engineers have sophisticated it so much that now any twangy Georgia talking guy, it'll come out right. It's basically error-free. And they even have one, which I don't dare order, that is devoted entirely to law and brief formatting and so on. So it comes out with the arrangement that is impressive, where you should never, ever allow a gut punch of a point to end at the bottom of a page and continue over on the next page. You might as well separate it, the reader, you might as well separate the reader's comprehension by a week if you're going to separate him for a page turn. And sometime, it doesn't make any difference if you're framing the reference or doing background or something like that. But if it's like that Jackson quote, don't break it in the middle or you lose the impact. A knockout punch becomes a left jab if you do it that way.
You were born when? What's your date of birth?
5/4/35, 1935.
And were you the first?
Yes.
And then other siblings?
Yes. 2 years later, my brother Bob was born. 2 years later, my brother David was born, both of whom have died. But there were three.
So you went to school in Iowa? Was there a class?
No. We were always bused to Panama.
Okay.
Big blue and white International bus number 4, driven by Kenny Mitchell, who wore gorgeous long-sleeved suede gloves. I used to think, God, he must be rich to have those gloves. But you, Greg, as a member of a firm that does an awful lot of work for schools. You'll curdle your urine when I tell you this. Kenny Mitchell, used to run that bus like a military drill sergeant. I'm telling you now, I don't want any food left on this bus, and I don't care whose food it is. If it's under your seat or in your space, you're paying for it. Now, that was the type he ran. And guess what? Everybody loved him. You didn't hate him. And he used to take those gloves. And when a couple guys would always get into a pushing contest or fighting contest, if he had to stop that bus, he used to warn every now and then, don't make me stop this bus. I have a route I have to complete within a certain minute at every stop. And if I got to stop this bus to come back to put an end to some trouble, it's going to be a sad day. And he'd take off those gloves, and they were about 12, 13 inches long. And he would whack the offender across the face, yelling at them, shaming them in front of everybody else in the bus. But guess what? His bus never had trouble after that. And he would do that a few times every year. Now, Greg, that's something that lefties take to the Supreme Court. Cruel, and you can't discipline, physically discipline. But it's just like living two lives. There was one life where those kind of rules existed, and there's today's life that maybe with that torture and public embarrassment, you're creating the commencement of a later year mental breakdown, Mr. Bus Driver. That's why you can't do it. But
do you remember, you would have been probably 6 years old, December 7th, 1941?
Yeah, but I remember it, if that's what you're asking me.
Yeah.
I remember very well because my Uncle Kenneth was 17 years old, and he enlisted in the Navy the next day after Pearl Harbor because he didn't want to get drafted into the Army. And instead of that terrible fate of going into the Army, he wound up surviving 5 different sinkings of a ship. A lot of times 70% died, 80% died. One of them, there was a book written about called The Saga of the Mighty A. A was for the Atlanta, was the name of the ship. And he was on that one. But he was always in the engine room. And when the ship sunk, that always went to the top, upside down, and they got out. But anyway, that answers your question.
Was that during your early years at school? Was that something that was discussed at Panama School? Was there sort of a weekly, monthly report of what's going on in the war? Was that of conscious?
I was so young then that I never got the news, but we were this conscious of it. back in those days, because of our locality, where it's the world's most oversupply with milkweed pods, we used to take to school every day a bag full of milkweed pods, that because they were used in all the survival cushions in the ocean. We also did tin cans. My grandmother, who had more influence on me than anybody, simply because I didn't listen to my mother, but I did listen to Grandma Berkey. She would make Bob and I, Dave always got a free ride, take every can, tomato paste, pork and beans cans, and she used to make us tear off all the paper, then wash it, and then cut the bottom out of it just like the top was already cut out, and then step on it. And if you're not heavy enough to flatten it, you call me, because I can flatten anything. And she was 5'4" and probably 190. And we'd do it together. We turned it into fun. And we would take those flattened cans, aluminum cans, to school every day religiously. You were not old enough, but we used to buy war bond stamps, green one and red one. That's probably the best investment I ever made. Not the biggest, but the best return. Because you got 25 cents, 25% return at the end of the war. And they redeemed every one of them. The same with war bonds. And we used to have contests all the time. And I used to have to summarize what was going on over the loudspeaker. And I tried my best to do a good job of that. But we were very conscious of the war, mostly because every family had somebody in the war. And I can still name, there came into being back then a thing called Gold Star Mothers. I can mentally take you on a bike trip right now over by Donnie Ryder's house, Gold Star Mother. All of them were in the Battle of the Bulge from our area, and all of them were killed. And on Sundays, quite frequently, 2-3 times a year, my father would drive all around the country and make us notice how many Gold Star flags were in the window. And everybody put it in the window. Nobody kept it in a drawer, because that was your part of the war. But
Halloween, 1947. The book talks about the book Dreaming of a Roller Coaster by your mother. Talks about a person who will assume is you. Could you describe a little bit about your experience? You a polio victim. There was an epidemic going on in 1947.
yes,
You probably didn't know much about it at all. Then all of a sudden you get...
actually the whole country lived in fear of polio. It was a big thing then. And there used to be radio broadcasts saying, don't worry individually because only 1 out of every 1,000,000 kids comes down with polio. And I used to be greatly comforted by that because, God, how big is 1,000,000? It was beyond infinity to a 10 or 12-year-old brain. Well, that statistic is not very comforting if you happen to be that one kid. And I was that kid. And I remember Halloween, my brothers and our neighbor friends were going to go out, and we'd had plotting it for days, what we were going to do, and it's unthinkable. But I laid down just because I had a bad headache or didn't feel good. And I thought I'd be better by 8 or 9 o'clock when we were going to sneak out and do a number on Al Showalter across the street and other routes that we'd planned. And I told my brothers and their friends, go without me, I'll try to catch up with you halfway through. Halfway through, I felt worse. And but I did go to sleep. And the next morning, when I got up, my mother came into the bedroom and said, Artie, you got to get up. And I did get up, and when I got off the bed and stood up, I went down in a heap because my legs wouldn't hold me up. And she called immediately Dr. Grant, A.A. Grant over in Sugar Grove. And said this, and he said to her, Macy, I'm not going to come all the way over there to tell you, but this sounds awfully much like polio, and you better get him into the hospital, Jamestown General Hospital, right away. And he said, matter of fact, I'm going to have an ambulance come all the way out there, and you have them packed and ready. And my father just got home from Salamanca about the time the ambulance arrived, and he carried me out so the ambulance guys didn't have to come in, and they put me on where I'm laying down. And I'll even remember looking up and seeing all of the tree leaves passing over my head as I'm looking out the top of it. First vehicle I was ever in that had a glass top. First time I ever saw my father cry was when he told the ambulance driver to get him into the hospital right away because we think he has polio. And I sure did. I recall well all the lights and the smells and everything else. And the Jamestown General Hospital then had a quarantined section, which was the perfectly round sun porch. On the end, even today, when I drive over 3rd Street Bridge, I look across and see that sun porch where all the polio patients were. And from that trip until the next many months later, the only view I ever got of my parents or my brothers was through a mirror, which was a piece of metal, shiny metal like chrome, through a visitor's window, because we were all quarantined. Now we know it was never contagious. All of that quarantining and all of that, that was all unnecessary. And they believed in what was called the Sister Kenny, Kenny, treatment, which was very hot packs of wool blankets put into a steamer. And a lot of times they'd get it too hot and it would blister. That only happened to me a few times, but one other one, who you probably remember, he was older than I, Paul Rosen.
Yeah.
He went on to become a car salesman, a very good one, and always in a wheelchair, if you remember. He was 2 beds away from me, and one of his best friends, who's mentioned in the book by a different name, was Bill Cass. Although Paul Rosen went to Southwestern and Cass went to Frewsburg, and in those days, Frewsburg did not play any kind of football because they had earlier years some horrible injury or death, and they discontinued football. But Bill used to come in and visit him, Paul Rosen, along with his sister Nancy, and there's a reverse name used in there, but they were always trying to cheer Paul up, and I didn't know him very well except hi, how you doing type then, but there were other kids, David Vidal, who became an account executive with a phone company. He was one of them, and we all got treated the same. And I don't know if it's in there or not, but I knew early on that I was the guy that had to keep everybody else from feeling, woe is me, you know, what kind of a God would do this? I had to keep them upbeat. And the way I did it, I learned from one of the expert doctors that used to come down from Buffalo, Russell B. Erickson. He was an orthopedic surgeon. And Hilding Nelson was another one. And neither of those guys had any background in polio, but neither did anybody else. But Russell B. Erickson used to say to me, the best way to keep anybody from feeling down in the dumps, which is a shirt sleeve word, but early depressions, is to keep them busy in something interesting. And so almost immediately, I started writing the polio press. And I made each one of the kids responsible for contributing something. And I put it in the press, even if it was worthless, just so that they could see their name. And keep in mind, this is back when there were still a lot of people in the military. And I think we had gotten into the beginning of the Korean War. And long story short, what turned out to be a circulation of 70 or 100 of these polio presses being mailed to people in the U.S. As soon as the military got involved, and they wanted to receive them, because a lot of people sent their copy with a letter they wrote, we had over 2,000 on the mailing list. And my Aunt Geneva, who was in charge of a large office that had mimeograph. Can you remember that word, mimeograph?
Oh, yeah.
And she would mimeograph 2,000 of these polio presses. By the way, I still got every one of them somewhere around. And one of the great stories that I still get asked about, I met David Vidal in an x-ray room recently, and he remembered me, and he said, "Art, do you remember the polio mouse?" Well, I do. Here's what it was. A mouse in a hospital ran across the floor dragging his tail, and we saw him several times. And I said to David Vidal and Ray Dennison, I said, "Look that mouse has got polio. He's dragging his tail. And he's got polio in his tail." Then I wrote that up into an article, and that's why the mouse's tail drags, is because he had polio. Mm-hmm. Then there used to be a radio personality by the name of Jim Sharp. And he used to come in and do a Saturday program, but he had to have masks and hoods and so on. But we would be on the radio, and believe it or not, the guys in the military, people at home, were all fascinated by, because nobody knew anything about polio, including doctors. And this polio press, each issue covered something like how to make hot packs, how to do that, and what they did to make our muscles return, quote, quote. You saw how well Paul's came back. And I was lucky. I'd go so far as to say I was lucky to have been stricken with polio, because it made me start thinking, which I never did before. At an age 10, 11, 12, in that range, I would think, God, how am I going to take care of myself when I get out of here? What's it going to be like, etc.? And it made me get serious. By the way, I was in there one day over 10 months, and that was the entire school year from Halloween until graduation. And I wound up number 2 in the class and passed all the exams because I did have a tutor, and God love her, she was well-intentioned, but people who can't paint shouldn't become an interior decorator, you know? But my aunt and my teachers at Panama, especially Helen Johnson, she used to make me read books that thick and do a report that is sufficient to pass muster as a book review. And I don't know where she ever got so friggin' many books, but she kept me going night and day. And my best entertainment, Greg, you'll identify with this, every Friday night there used to be on the radio a thing called Friday Night Fights. And the announcer was Don Dumphy. And I used to pull the blankets up over my head and announce a fight just like Don Dumphy did. And I couldn't wait for Friday to roll around. And that was when Sugar Ray, Tony Graziano, and people that were literally great in their time. And now you have to be an aficionado to even recognize their name.
So how long were you in at Jamestown General Hospital? That's where you did your rehab, was there, right?
Right.
Yeah. How long were you there? The ward closed at some point, right?
What?
The ward.
Oh, that was years later.
Yeah.
I got out 10 months and a few days after I went in. I went in on Halloween night, or actually next morning. And I got out after the kids had already had their school year finished.
You gave it a walkout?
Pardon me?
We gave it a walkout.
If that's your only question, the answer is yes. But how did you walk out? I had a full-length brace from my ankle all the way up to my hip, and with a lock on the knee. So it was perfectly stiff. And it was easy to pull up a lever and unlatch it so it would bend. But if you ever did that, by accident or otherwise, when you were standing up, it was ugly. But that wasn't the worst part. I also had what was then called a back brace, which is 2 iron rods, flat pieces of metal, not rods, on either side of the spine from the coccyx area, which is that bony point on the back of your neck. From there on down to basically your hip line at the widest place. And in order to keep that on and keep pressure, there were 4 corset attachments which you always had to pull in order to keep it tight. And I had to wear that back brace because during the 10 preceding months, I had developed what is called a scoliosis, curvature of the spine, which is in shorthand an S curve in your spine. The spine cannot withstand one curve this way and the rest straight, because for every fraction of an inch the curve goes, let's say, to the left, there has to be a compensating curve that goes the other way on the bottom half of the spine. Now, the muscle that was most affected by polio was the Gray's Anatomy word is latissimus dorsi, which is your flat, what do they call them, abs muscles. And from 12 years old until this morning, I've always had a protruding abdomen. And Lucian Ledestro used to say to me, if there's anybody on this earth that can convince anybody else that you're not fat, you've got a weakened abdominal wall, I'm going to use that, Art. I'm going to use that. And he said, but you're a fat bastard nevertheless, okay? And but it really is true. And it happens very commonly with anybody that has a scoliosis type of curvature. And also everybody that's ever known me, and nobody ever says anything, but they notice that my right shoulder is much lower than my left shoulder. That's because the trapezius muscle in your body, which is the quadrangular shaped, powerful muscle that weightlifters, you notice, always got big bulging muscles on the top of their shoulders. That's a trapezius muscle. And the right trapezius in me is basically gone ever since 12 years old. Now, has this hurt me? Is it painful? Was it ever painful? The truthful answer is no. I think I've endured modest or greater pain so long that you come to think that that's part of life. But to say any of those things ever were painful, the answer is no. But
How long did you have that brace on in the leg and the back?
I got rid of it before I was supposed to, but it was another 9 months. It was into my next school year. And shortly after that, I got rid of the leg brace. And after that, right up to this very day, when I step on my right leg, it has to be perfectly straight. You can't have a fraction of an inch of flex in it. An analogy would be, I have to walk with my right leg as though it were composed of two upright Tinker Toy sticks, as long as they're perfectly straight, good as anybody else's. The moment there is even any tip, it just becomes wet spaghetti. And now I'm worrying about falling down because, never mind that commercial, I've fallen, I can't get up. I cannot get up. If I'm not around a set of monkey bars, which you never are, or some furniture with drawers or something like that, I gotta lay there until somebody comes. Now, I'm more conscious of it now than I ever have been, all through college and law school, and I got so I could walk so that it was not visible. My problems were not visible unless I walked a long distance or multiple times in courts where I'm going to be once or twice. I never get detected because they listen a lot more than they watch. And they never judge lawyers by their body type. And so I don't think it's handicapped me. I know I'm curious to some observers, but that goes with the territory. All in all, I was a more blessed kid than any other kid by having gone through this, because it made me serious. And I got so that with Dr. Russell B. Erickson, he said, Arthur, you know, there's only 312 muscles in your body. You could probably learn the names and the spellings of every one of them. And I never knew until years later he did that in order to make me think about things other than bad luck. And I got so I could name every single one of them. And the only one I misspelled was quadriceps, because in Grey's Anatomy, it is spelled the way British spell it, because Dr. Henry Grey, that wrote Grey's Anatomy, which, by the way, was written 10 years before Abraham Lincoln was president of this country, and it is still, to this day, the absolute gold standard in anatomy. Every second-year medical student in the whole world, and especially the whole United States, reads Grey's Anatomy, even now, 160, 70 years later. But in Grey's Anatomy, it is spelled P-A-E, ortho, P-A-E, pedic. In U.S., it's P-E-D-I-C. And most doctors, when they use the word, spell it the American way. And but there's nobody just trying to spell the way they spell most words. would ever spell medical words very well, because there are differences. But once you learn them, it's second nature. It's just like a golf swing. That sounds simple. All you do is swing the club and hit the ball, and you can make $6-7 million a year. Okay? Therefore, Jack Nicklaus's old golf clubs ought to be worth at least $4 million. No, they're not. They're worth $649 in the Sears store window, just like every other set of golf clubs, because it all depends who's swinging them. Okay, it's nothing to do with clubs. That's an exaggeration. Some modern clubs are moved the game farther.
Now you tell us.
But it's still, the point is still well taken.
So you read your mother's book, Macy Jane Bailey, Dreaming on a Roller Coaster, Never Give Up Your Dreams, and we both did. And if you read it now, what would be the takeaway for you? I mean, this is your basically biography.
Rather than try to characterize it, here is the experience that it's had. Most people and most buyers of it bought it because it's inspirational. In Montana and other western states, they bought several of them as a motivating or inspirational. To me, it's just things that happened. But I forgot to mention that when I used to visit my grandfather in Akron, Ohio, when the family's up here and he's still down there, and even after they all returned, we used to go, because my father was a employee of the Erie Railroad, you could go anywhere in the United States for free, totally for free, if it was on a railroad, because each railroad all across the country honored the passes of the other railroads. But we used to jump on a train in Corey sometimes, or Jamestown sometimes, where the old depot was, and ride to Akron, where my grandfather would pick us up. We'd be there for weeks. But one of the things I mentioned to Greg, my grandfather was the president for several years of the Greater Cleveland-Akron Council of Churches. That meant all of the Protestant type churches in that area. And every year he would invite Billy Graham to come to the Akron-Cleveland area and have one of his crusade meetings, which was always held at the Rubber Bowl in Akron, which is half as big or somewhat like that of Rich Stadium, but it's the same stadium. And every summer I would go down, I'd listen to Billy Graham, all the 20, 30,000 people. When he got to the end of each crusade, he would ask all the people to come down and George Beverly Shea, that gorgeous baritone voice, would sing All Come. And it sounds funny today, I was always going to be an evangelist at that age. I could do it. I was good at it. Most people never met Billy Graham. I used to meet him every summer because my grandfather insisted that he stay at his big house in Firestone Park. And I don't know if Billy Graham wanted to or not, but he did. And each year he would have us come down on a train 2 or 3 days before so we could meet and have dinner with Billy Graham. And my brothers didn't care. It was a non-deal to them. To me, he is the greatest evangelist. That's what I'm going to be. And I study. I knew all of the scriptures, knew how to be emotional about it, and so on. And I was a long time getting over it, but that's one fork in the road. I like Yogi Berra. I'm glad I didn't take that one.
Well, I could see you giving an altar call at any time. What was the reception of your classmates? You were out a year, you were at Jamestown General Hospital, then you show up in Panama one day. They hadn't seen you, you had probably a little bit of a pronounced limp. And
Yeah.
what was the reception?
Yeah, it was a pretty major limp back then. It was amazingly non-eventful. Again, Helen Johnson had beaten each one over the head by saying, look, when Artie comes back, act like he's just been out with flu. He's no different. He's the same as he was before. And I don't know how much she had to do with it, or they were just mature enough to perceive that's the right way. But that's how it was. And I was, of course, don't forget, I would say nobody ever put me down. I never felt, you see it on TV all the time, somebody fragile got pushed over the cliff because of some comments made. That never happened to me. And I think I became more authoritative than I was before. I think I matured a lot during that 1 year. Certainly learned a lot, mostly medicine, primarily medicine, but taking charge of every group I was ever a member of came naturally. I admit this, I might have used that ultra-confident facade more as a compensating mechanism because of the rest of the story. I don't know. But after that, I became the president of, Salamanca. I went to college. I was the president of the whole student body up there, which at that time had 20.
University of Buffalo.
Yes, there were 24,000 students at that time. And law school. I became the president of what they called not student council, Student Bar Association, SBA president. And that was open to all the votes in the whole school. And it was a competitive position. And one of the smartest lawyers I've ever known was beating the drum to get elected instead of me, and that was Bill Gardner, who Greg will tell you later was one of the absolute smartest lawyers that were ever around here. But then the same thing happened in the American Trial Lawyers. I was on the board before I was 30, the Board of Governors, and that part was really astonishing because back at the time, New York was dominated by New York City, as it always is. The greatest trial lawyers, forget all other lawyers, Jack Fuchsberg, Joe Kellner, Alfred Julian, Mo Levine, all of these are Babe Ruth names if you were in the law business. And I was still elected as the governor from the state of New York to sit on the board. And several of those guys supported me, made speeches in my behalf. I didn't understand it then. I don't understand it now because a lawyer would be considered successful if he was just a bag carrier for Al Julian or Jack Fuchsberg, who is, to most lawyers, Jacob D. Fuchsberg of the Court of Appeals, and so on. But I did well there early, and all of the other, I was younger when I first year on the board of governors than the sons of most of the other governors. But they always accepted me and often agreed with me. We had a lot of controversial subjects all the time, unbelievable, where two sides are passionate about how right they are, both sides, equal and opposite. And that was my biggest shock of being on the board. How when you study psychology, one of the first concepts you encounter is the concept of the perfect dilemma, where the choice in the right-hand direction is equal to the choice in the left-hand direction. And when those get equally balanced, the pull either way is equally strong. That's what collapses are made of. Everybody can easily choose between good and bad. And yet, when you get into the area of more good and less good the closer they get, the more perfect the dilemma. Same thing applies in badness. And I was stricken. In fact, I think one of the reasons why I went on the board so fast and so young is because of a couple cases that I had developed as a young lawyer, one of which is the then famous Johansson versus Liberty Mutual, where I broke, in those days, employers, it's funny to say now, Greg, because today in California, no restrictive covenant is any good anyway, period. And most other states have followed California like they have in other areas. But in those days, 1961, every large corporation could put a clause into the employment contract that if you leave the company, even if you're discharged, you cannot, will not ever seek or accept employment in the same field or any field which is competitive with us, okay? And you're subject to an injunction if you do that, and damages and being sued. Well, long story short, Fred Johansson came to this town as a Liberty Mutual agent. And in a few years, he built up the biggest and best insurance agency in all of Jamestown. You can get arguments from some historical people, but they aren't numbers, dollars, amount of policies. Fred was always top. And one day he decided, hey, I can take all those customers and do my own agency and make 300-400% of what I'm making now. Ergo, he did it. And lo and behold, down out of the sky, biggest, strongest law firms in New York State, both in Buffalo and New York City, landed on him, got an injunction, etc. And he went to his very good friend, Al McKee. And I never knew Fred back when I first came to town. I met him shortly thereafter as a friend of Al's. Anyway, he went to Al McKee. And I think Al McKee is one of the smartest lawyers. He was a Cornell grad, near the top of his class. But more important than that, he was an undergraduate literature major, and he was a magnificent writer. And you put those two skills together, and you're talking about a smart cookie. And Fred came to him in tears, literally in tears. And Al took it in and said, you never should have done it, and gave him holy hell. And long story short, it led to a trial. And before the trial, I worked with Al every night, every day, on our theory, which we had developed. I was 26 or 7 at the time, based on Liberty Mutual's language in its covenant was so broad, and the analogy that I came up with and used throughout the trial was this man, if he left Liberty Mutual and then went to work for Jamestown Mutual as a janitor, and I swept the motion as a janitor, he would be subject to this injunction. And I based it that this was a violation of the U.S. Constitution. It's depriving him of his right to make a living. Long story short, I won the case. It went viral. And when I say I, McKee was in charge every minute, never talked to me about it until we wound up at trial in Mayville in front of a judge named Emil Cohen, the father-in-law of Don Lubick, the tax attorney. Anyway, Al said to me, he said, "Arthur, would you pick the jury?" And I said, "Sure." And I had done that in Buffalo a lot, always for free, and so on. But I was good at it, and most of the trial was to the judge without a jury. And the only reason we picked a jury was standby if he ruled. Long story short, after the jury was picked, Al told me, seated at the council table just before the gavel came down, he said, "Art, I'm awful sick. I'm going to throw up. Could you please take over the rest of this trial?" And I thought, Jesus Christ, what do I do now? But I did the best I could. I got a lot of good breaks. And like every trial, it's not won when you're in the court. It's won during the months preceding that, where you line up witnesses to support everything you're going to push and other witnesses that can destroy everything they are going to push. And we had done that very well. Long story short, that ruling came down, and it was the first trial ever in the U.S. where a restrictive covenant was defeated on constitutional grounds. Well, guess what happened? Once that hit, there's a famous, the National Underwriter magazine for insurance people, that was front page. You would be amazed how many Liberty Mutual employees resigned the next week. Okay. Our phone was ringing off the hook. Could you please? And Greg will tell you about this, every lawyer worries about not getting enough good work. You call a plumber, and if he is booked solid, he'll tell you, "I can't do it. I'm booked for the next week. I can't take care of it." You call a carpenter. You call most other artisans. You get the same answer. You call a lawyer. Yes, yes, bring it right in. Bring it right in. Okay. That is the nature of lawyers, to agree to do more than they can do. And it always boomerangs. But anyway, I did exactly that. Every phone call I got, I'd say, yes, I got to make sure your facts are similar to our facts. And I was running all over the goddamn country with these Liberty Mutual cases. And won them all, which was easy to do because that precedent of the first one was right on. But it didn't apply in other states until the case. And that, I think, is what got me on the American Trial Lawyers Board first, because it represented a reach out into a field different than pure negligence, rear end at a red light, medical malpractice, wrong leg amputated, and so on. That was the focus of the American trial lawyers. They never went beyond that. And whatever career I've later had in the American Trial Lawyers Association is because of that. I was always just beyond the envelope where they are. So that's how that happened.
All right, give me, just so we can tie in a little bit of a knot here. You graduated from University of Buffalo Law School what year?
1959.
So 59, then what do you do before you get to Jamestown? And how do you get to Jamestown?
Okay, that one is easy because I had done a lot of trial work even when I was in law school, because I founded in the University of Buffalo School of Law what is known as the Indigent Prisoner Association, because back in those days there was no such thing as public defenders, and therefore every citizen who got into criminal trouble had no lawyer. And so, unless they had money, but for all the other 80%, they had to accept an assigned counsel, meaning somebody the bar appointed for them. And the judges in those days, believe it or not, appointed lawyers alphabetically going down through the list of current members of the bar. Okay, maybe the next guy alphabetically is somebody who is estates and trusts experience, spent his whole life doing that, and never picked a jury, never was in a courtroom, but he's a lawyer. You have an obligation. So those kind of lawyers would quickly refer the job they had to do to the Indigent Prisoner Association. So I got to work with Harold Farringer, Hal Boreanaz, Vincent Doyle, John Condon, all of whom were 2, 3, 4 years ahead of me in law school, all of whom were magnificent criminal defense lawyers. And I worked with them. In fact, there was a time in the early days that Farringer Boreanaz and Vince Doyle all used the same office. One room, actually two-room office. There was one classy-looking desk, and I was their investigator on all the cases they had and loved it. Didn't get paid a goddamn penny, but I was becoming good. And nobody that's ever been in a Western New York bar will tell you they wouldn't give a right arm to work with those three lawyers. And I did that all the time I was in Buffalo. Meanwhile, during the day, I was working for a collection bankruptcy firm called Goldstein Nava. But that was just enough because that was a salary, stupid low salary, $75 a week, something like that. But I did that job in order to live because I got married the day after I was sworn in to the bar. I was sworn in on March 9th, and I got married on March 10th. Now, I had to have some income. That income was that law firm. But as soon as I could get away, I'd work till midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, because the witnesses that we dealt with were always on the lower side of life, Ridge Road in Lackawanna, Michigan Avenue, and so on. But if you're going to get a statement from somebody who was there, you're not going to get him Saturday morning or any day of the week. You're going to get him at night at the Gaiety, which is the wildest, craziest bar, and so on. So I had a lot of trial, not a lot, but significant trial experience when one day I got a telephone call from Dean Hyman. He said, "Arthur, I got a letter today. I wish you'd come over and read it. I think you'll be interested in." And it was a letter from Lynn Van Vleck and Al McKee stating, "Dear Dean Hyman, our trial lawyer partner, Charles E. Goodell, has just been elected to Congress a year and a half ago or whatever, and he's covered our trial calendar even though he was no longer practicing. But he's moving to Washington now, and we need some trial lawyer that has had some trial experience." And Dean Hyman, I'll never forget it, he said, "Arthur, you should be interested in this because it fits your mold, and besides that, it'll take you back to the same town as Robert H. Jackson, because he was always a Jackson fan, worked for him, etc." And the very next Saturday morning, I drove down to Jamestown and interviewed with Lynn Van Vleck and Al McKee. And yes, I didn't even know what I was agreeing to, but that was for me. And been here ever since.
They had a need, didn't they? I mean, part of the incentive on Lynn's part and Al's part is they had some immediate court activity that they had to do.
Oh, yeah. Let me tell you this. The reason why they hired me on the spot is because it was the last few weeks in August, and in September they had several of Charlie Goodell's old cases on the calendar in the Supreme Court up in Mayville, and they were definitely, Lynn Van Black was 78 years old then, plus never tried a lawsuit in his life. Al McKee, I just told you how much he liked trials, and so I told him I would cover those cases 2 weeks later, which I did. But they happened to be in front of the worst curmudgeon of a judge that ever was in Western New York. He, in those days, lawyers that weren't ready would just say, I'd like the case postponed to next month. You get cases 2 years old because they kept being postponed. But not with Hamilton Ward. Judge Hamilton Ward, he had an oversized gavel, and as soon as you'd say, I'd like that case to be postponed. Counsel, are you a lawyer or are you not a lawyer? Because you certified this was ready for trial. The term is statement of readiness. You got to swear under oath that you're ready to go to trial. Then when you're called, you can't say, gee, golly gosh, I'm not ready. So he used to enforce that all to hell. Those guys would rather take a fate worse than death before they go up to Mayville. That's why I was hired so quick, and so on. But I got through all those cases, and I will say this much. Charlie Goodell himself, who was a high honors Yale Law School grad, high honors at Williams undergrad, a trial lawyer for the Department of Justice in Washington, which only goes to the best. And then he came up to practice with his brother John and Van Vleck and McKee. And then, as you all know, he was elected to Congress. And this is long after he was elected. He covered them for a long time afterwards because he had such presence and prominence that he could postpone without winding up with lashing. But I handled all his, I think there were 5. A couple of them weren't that good, but they weren't that big. The other 3 were significant. And I won them all, largely because he had them very well prepared. I didn't have much to do with Charlie. He had a guy, administrative assistant named Bill Gifford. And Bill Gifford had me write 3 or 4 speeches for Charlie to give up here when he came back. I got compliments out of that, but it's not like doing it yourself. But in any event, that's how I came to Jamestown. And even before I came here, I had heard about the American Trial Lawyers Association and how much they would teach people who hadn't done it. And man, they are the greatest. I used to spend every penny I had to go to Chicago, New York, Las Vegas over and over, where the top trial lawyers in the country would teach all the rest. And they all became great. The worst guy in ATLA is an excellent trial lawyer. And I became fascinated by the speakers on the platform, and I used to think someday, I'm going to be up there. And one of the early presidents appointed me as an assistant CLE chairman. CLE is for continuing legal education. That's what they're all about. That's what their seminars are about. And I did a good job as assistant, and the next president appointed me the CLE chairman of all of ATLA. 50 seminars a year were my responsibility. And not 50 of them were not headliners. That was only 4 times a year where the headliners were. But each state, you had to hold one in each state. And I did a very good job in my first year. And the next president, a guy named Leonard Ring from Chicago, the first one that appointed me was J.D. Lee of Tennessee. Both of them are in the Hall of Fame of trial lawyers. I was the CLE chairman the second year, and that was the year that I started the rule: no attorney appearing on a CLE national program. That's one of the 4 each year. Can appear unless they have a well-researched, publishable presentation of what their lecture is going to be on, handed in so many weeks before, so it can be bound into a convention transcript. And I was about as popular as a venereal disease, but I knew if I didn't enforce it, it would never happen. If I could be talked out of that. And I held in, and I got each president to back me up 100%. Because prior to that, the guy that won the biggest verdicts, the most millions, he would pull out of his pocket, and he would just, forgive the term, a 2-hour bullshit session, all having good points, but not organized, no cases, nothing publishable. At the end of my term, and Greg, you've seen those ATLA.
Yeah.
They're that thick. I'm going to give you one, Randy. I won't interrupt right now. But when you, like all the new fields, nursing home liability, you take the transcript on that, you'll be able to try one of those yourself. It's all there. And including the expert witnesses. I worked later with a guy who wrote, not a guy, one of the greatest trial lawyers in the U.S. His name was Harry Philo, Philo. He wrote lawyer's desk reference called LDR. Every lawyer, no matter what his specialty is, can tell you what LDR is. And it is a collection of all the experts that you need in all kinds of trials, all of which came out of Harry Philo and Dean Robb's. They had a law firm in Detroit called, they were the two principals, and they had been developing a whole pull-out drawer full of expert witnesses that they'd used in products cases, other kinds of cases, and it developed that everybody else in the organization would go to them to find who were the good experts, who are the bad ones. That's more important than knowing who is the best one. That's easy. Who is the one that can sink your ship, you know? They had a dossier on each one of them. And they had a young partner named Richard Goodman, the son of the founder. It used to be Goodman, Crockett, Eden, Robin, Philo. But Dick Goodman started to put it more in a book form because of the thousands of phone calls or letters they get from other lawyers. Harry, who can I use to prove the difference between beach marks in a broken tie rod case? Now, without wasting time, beach marks are a very identifying characteristic of a piece of metal that is severed in two because of constant creeping little fractures, and one which broke on impact. So back in those days, all the Corvair cases, they'd always have a broken tie rod. General Motors, hey, the tie rod broke when he hit the bank. The plaintiff said, no. It happened over a period of time, and it broke, and that's what caused the crash. All right, that's just a typical example. When you engineers study, metallurgical engineers, nobody else can testify except metallurgical engineers. They will show you these beach marks. They're called beach marks because they look the same way the rows of sand look on a beach. And that fracture occurred because of a defect in the tie rod, not because of a negligent driver. All right? Now, you can see why that LDR is infinitely powerful. Well, anyway, one of my claims to fame is that on that spine of that book, I think still to this day, it's there. I coined the phrase, if that's what you call it, because everybody used to ask Harry Philo at every convention we would have. He was always a speaker because these experts are so important. And always somebody would say, Harry, why do you work your life off in order to develop all this expertise and then give it away to everybody that has a license? And Harry could never say what that was. And it used to be embarrassing because he would start out explaining, I think I have a duty as a lawyer, and he'd wind up saying, I'm not going to do it anymore because that's my whole secret, you know. And anyway, I said, Harry, after he just finished speaking, you got to find a way to answer that. And he said, how would you answer it? I said, I don't know, but let me have a couple drinks and I'll come up with something. And I did. And it is, when you're in a profession as sacred as the law, that's just a preamble, it is not mine for me. It is ours for us. That's why you do it. It's not mine for me, saith Harry Philo. It's ours for us, implying the whole profession gets better. The tide raises all boats if you give it a chance. And he put that on the name of that book. It's been there for 40 years.
It's fantastic. You've been at this for 2.5 hours, Arthur. You're unbelievable.
I've got to leave.
Yeah, I got to go to a funeral, so it's a perfect timing. We've gotten ourselves through your academics. We've gotten you to Jamestown. I have a whole page of notes that you gave me, and I've got more on another page. So this is session 1. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, fine, yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Very.
You got, you're amazing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to wear you out, but we'll pick up some Saturdays are the best for you.
Yeah, they are.
We'll probably after Thanksgiving we'll pick it up on some December Saturday and keep on plowing ahead.
Right. Because we'll eventually get into the law part.
Okay, we're just see this here.
Yeah.
That's stuff you gave me. We only hit item 1. We got into antitrust, Nazi stuff, all of that art. I know this will take another 3 hours just to warm up.
You know, one of the things that you should ask, and I'll prepare for it and get concise answers, what are the things in your life and practice that you are most proud of? Okay? And my secretary pulled that blue notebook down at the end.
Yeah.
Grab that, please. And I do not know who wrote that. I don't know why. All I know is No, take it over with you. I know what's in it. That arrived in a mail with a Sherman, New York postmark. And some old lady in Sherman clipped out every article as the case developed where the Chautauqua Lake Bridge was stopped dead in its tracks with an injunction from federal Judge Curtin.
Yeah.
And I was the guy hired to get that bridge injunction lifted. And I was scared to death, but I did it.
That I did not know.
Yeah, that was one of my first major cases.
I did not know. Well, that's
We'll get back to that.
My God, that's I'm in. We do a lot of that at Chautauqua. Aha! I got an idea. Another program.
Yeah. You can take that with you, Greg. If
I would like to look.
now some woman took all the newspaper articles during that whole warfare, and everybody in this county was watching me. And if I'd ever lost that, the goddamn bridge would go through between Frewsburg and so on. And let me tell you how it all started. You guys probably know the legend. In Sherman, there was a man named Norval T. Reed. And he had 2 sons that were in that auction business with him. And they owned 13 different farms all around the Sherman-Clymer corridor, Finley Lake. And when that bridge injunction hit the papers, with all the lefties behind it, Royal Strubing down to community college, they had a goddamn expert. Here, I'll tell you, this is a good example of where experts come in. I knew how to counter those experts because of Harry Philo. And I had just finished 3 days of testimony out in Olathe, Kansas, where the stupid little minnows of a certain kind were going to be destroyed if they had that big federal highway go across there. And Norman Landau and I got that injunction lifted. And this is during, people think environmental law started when Trump denied, or people say he denied, the climate change. Hey, we're talking about early 60s, all right? We're talking about when down in Tennessee, remember I mentioned the name J.D. Lee? J.D. Lee was one of the few lawyers that always flew his own plane. And he says, Arthur, you got to get down here. I'm going to come get you. I'm going to be at the airport, whether you're there or not. If you're going to make me fly that far and stand me up, you won't be there. Otherwise, you're coming back down here to Knoxville. Because a little thing called a snail darter had stopped the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Dam, okay? And he said, I'm going to be a disgrace in my whole state if I don't get this done. And he said, I'm going to take the credit, but I don't have your brain. And I owed him so much. He was the guy that just appointed me national CLE director. He said, and I love to fly with him. That's another story. I bought my own airplane in 1966. I only started in 61, as I've told you. I thought that back in those days, a lawyer that can't fly in the 60s and 70s and coming years is going to be just like the lawyer that could not drive in the late 20s and 30s. That ain't going to be me. And I bought the first single engine cab seating airplane. I'll never forget it. There used to be a guy named Joel Hall that had the airport, and he had a Piper franchise. I bought brand new a Piper Lance, and that thing would go almost 300 miles an hour because the wheels would come up. That was the first single engine wheel retraction cabin seating, you know what I mean? By where you sit facing each other with a business board that drops down from both sides. And I'll never forget it. It cost $65,000. But I had just hit a goddamn verdict, which was big in those days. I'd disgrace to tell you how little it is today, but there was an extra 65. So I bought that plane. I didn't have my pilot's license. So I immediately got a hold of Skelly, Warren Skelton. You ever hear that name? Skelly?
Yeah.
Okay. And started to take lessons. He was so horrible to me. He made me, every time I'd do something wrong, he would scream and swear and say, "You dumb fuck, you're going to kill both of us." And he made me feel lower than whale shit. So I then went to Tony Mangine. And Tony Mangine was perfect. I went on and got my ticket. I never did fly much alone because I hired a young pilot by the name of Leroy Schnettler. And Lucian used to love him because he was with me for years. And I developed a theory then, which I'm still preaching. These professional pilots, Embry-Riddle is the Harvard of aviation school. You can hire their grads. They're goddamn bachelor degree people. You can make them become an investigator in any law firm, and they produce more widgets than they consume before they get near a plane. But meanwhile, you can schedule your partners. By the way, Greg, get ready for Rupp Boss to call your whatever division in your office does that to ask for you to use our plane, because I'm going to tell Rupp Boss they got to do this. Like, for example, my Piper Lance would take 5 people from the Jamestown airport to Toronto. Now, when you go to Toronto, how many hours does that take? And don't tell me it's less than 3.5.
No, all of that.
Okay. You can leave in my little plane and land downtown right at the tower on the edge of the lake in 37, 38 minutes. You can fly up to dinner, go to a play, fly right back, okay? Go to New York in 59, 65, so on. Go to Cleveland, 29 minutes. Now, you compare that to your guys that make incredible amounts per hour. What if they could make that hop and read papers all the way with a professional pilot flying them? I'm telling you, everybody wants to learn how to fly when they get flown. You know, it's intriguing. But
You're amazing.